this started with a piece I wrote for the Bath groups last January about the Downs Thompson Paradox, which I will talk about, but that's not the main thrust of my speech. It's about car competition and how we can get people onto public transport, because I think that's what we're all interested in. But how do we do it? It's not that easy, because we have a situation where cars dominate our cities. The only place in Britain where there are more public transport trips than car trips is central London. Everywhere else, cars exceed public transport trips by 6 or 7 to 1. And even in London, more than half of all the trips are made by car. We can model a competition between cars and public transport with generalised costs. It's quite a complicated econometric method. And if you want to know more about it, you can read my book, Light Rail Developers Handbook, which has it all set out. And what the generalised cost does is try to bring together all aspects of the competition into either time or money so they can be compared. Therefore, we ask the question, why do cars win and public transport lose? And the answer comes down to a lot of market research, which shows that people want speed and convenience. Their car's outside their door, they can jump in at any time, they don't have to know the timetable. So we can now look to two of my fellow academics, Malcolm Mogridge and Dr. Downs and Dr. Thompson's, who approached this problem from an academic point of view and showed that if you want traffic to go faster, you have to get public transport to go faster. And their logic was, up to now, the solution to congestion has been to build more roads. And we know from a lot of evidence that this is counterproductive, because all more road capacity does is to attract from public transport marginal users who go and buy a car or use the car that they're not using, and therefore create more traffic congestion. But here's some facts. Most journeys in Britain are short. Nearly 3/4 are less than 5 miles long. Half are less than 3 miles long. And a third are less than a mile long. And only a very small proportion are more than 30 miles long. So we're dealing with a situation where most trips are short and therefore should be amenable to public transport, and certainly should be amenable to not driving by car. But typically, 60% of those trips in urban areas are by car. And depending on the town or the city, it's at least 5 times those by public transport. Of course, many trips are walked. About twice as many trips are walked as made by public transport. And some car trips could be walked or could go by bike. And I don't know about your neck of the woods, but here in Liverpool, we have a big problem at schools, particularly primary schools, where parents insist on driving their children to school, causing chaos and air pollution around the school gates for journeys which are less than half a mile long. Absolutely crazy. So, putting that as a graph, trip length along the bottom, 1 to 6 miles, along the side, percentage of trips. So you can see 1 mile long trips, 70% are over that. And then 3 mile trips, 50%, 5 mile trips, 30%. Now, I did a comparison thinking perhaps we're different, perhaps it's different in the USA. So I looked at the USA data, and the red dots are the USA figures for the same distances. So you can see this characteristic of many journeys being short is not unique to Britain. And I suspect the same will be true of most European countries. So I had the fortune to work in a European country, in a continental country, since Britain is a European country. And I did a survey of nearly a year long of all the trips I made. And along the bottom was the travel door-to-door distance. Along the side is the door-to-door travel times. So walk at 5 miles an hour showed that 2 kilometres will take nearly half an hour. Whereas bus, 7 kilometres will take 30 over half an hour. Metro, very fast, 8 kilometres will take 20 minutes. But tram, ironically, was the same travel time for 8 kilometres as the metro, but quicker for all journeys shorter. And the reason for that was that tram stops are closer together, shorter walking distance. Metro stations are further apart, and they tend to be underground. So you've got to go down the escalator or a lift, and that adds time to the journey before you even start travelling. So what about the paradox? First one, Malcolm Muggeridge's paradox. The accepted wisdom until recently has been car congestion can be cured by building more roads. And we've seen examples of that all over the country and all over the world. But unfortunately, it doesn't reduce congestion, because what it does is attract from public transport people who are marginal users, who have got a car, but up to that point, public transport was slightly better. But with more road space, you can drive your car. And what happens is that more cars come out, and we end up with a traffic speed not dissimilar to the old traffic speed before the increased space. And that's one of the reasons why in London, traffic speed has been static at about 11 miles an hour for over 100 years, in spite of the population more than doubling and the number of cars increasing dramatically. If you want to increase traffic speed, the way to do that, Malcolm Muggeridge argued, is by having faster public transport services. Because what that does is to attract from cars marginal car users, either marginal because the journeys are nearly compatible in length or because of costs. And when you attract marginal car users onto public transport, you release road space, and therefore the speed of the remaining traffic increases. So we can sum this up by saying when public transport goes faster, there's less congestion. And I've applied the Downs Thompson Paradox to London. And along the bottom is the speed of public transport, and along the top side, as you can see, is the speed of road traffic. So if we put in buses operate at about 16 kilometres an hour, and that means that the equilibrium speed for all traffic is about 19 kilometres an hour, or nearly 20 kilometres an hour. Actually, it's a bit more. The trams, fastest service speed, 24 kilometres an hour, produces a faster traffic speed of about 32 miles an hour, 33 miles an hour. If we've put in a metro, well, then we get a big increase in speed, because metros go faster, 32 kilometres an hour, and therefore you get road traffic speeds up to 45 kilometres an hour. Although, interestingly, many cities in Britain are adopting the 20 mile an hour maximum speed, which of course is 30 kilometres an hour, which trams would help you to achieve without any difficulty. Paradox 2. Road traffic speed is determined by the speed of competitive public transport. Now, not all journeys have a public transport competitive mode, because we have a lot of random journeys. Even in towns, we have a lot of random journeys. And as an example, in Bristol, buses go at 16 kilometres an hour service speed average, although in the peak period, they go slightly slower. And if we look at the last data that I could find for 2019, this was the modal shift for work journeys. You can see car was 74%. Walk was actually 2.5 times more than bus trips. Bike was nearly the same as bus trips, and rail was the smallest of all, because there isn't really a rail service in Bristol. It's for trips out of Bristol. And if you look at the consequence of that, less than 50 journeys per head were made by people in Bristol. And given that there are 365 days a year, that means for most days, they didn't use public transport, they walked. Because if you use public transport, that means you use it for 25 days, because you go out there and usually come back by public transport. unless you've got a friendly mate at work who gives you a lift back. In comparison, Strasbourg, which I'm going to talk about later, the average there is over 300 tram trips per head per year. So that's 6 times more trips than is made by people in Bristol. That's nearly a trip every day by tram in Strasbourg. Well, if we want to improve traffic, we need to find ways to move vehicles. And the one universal way are roads. By and large, road space is fixed unless we enter a large program of demolition, which most people don't like. But the use of carriageways is variable. You don't have to have it just for cars. So as an example, if a carriageway is only for cars, then it has a capacity of about 1,000 trips, 1,000 cars per hour. Not a very nice situation, but that's what you have. If it was all bikes only, you could more than treble that, 3,200 per hour. If it was only buses, you could quadruple that to 4,000 per hour. If it was trams, it's over 8,000 an hour. But we haven't been here before, have we? Here's a picture that London Transport produced in 1965, showing all the cars carrying 69 people who could be on one route master bus. But it's a question of how do you get the people in the cars onto public transport. And that's the speeding up of my theory talk today. Well, the idea will be to build a metro because that provides the best competition against cars, fastest journeys, more space. But construction time and disruption are very high, and the cost is extremely high. We know from the most recent metro line built in Britain, namely the Elizabeth line in London, it cost £21 billion and was 4 years late in completion. And I thought you might like a picture. This is the Washington Metro, which also overran in cost and overran in time to construct. Well, the Department for Transport in Britain, if you ask them, how do we improve public transport, their answer usually is a busway, because buses are quick and flexible and we can use them everywhere. And of course, Bristol is following the pioneering busway in Runcorn. And finally, we have trams. This is in Paris, where a road has been dug up and has been replaced by tram tracks and grass to make it look nice and sustainable. I want to talk about 2 local people in Bristol. You may or may not have heard of them. One is George White. He founded a company which, amongst other things, opened a tramway in Bristol, which operated from 1875 to 1941, when the Luftwaffe bombed it out of existence. And Bristol was the first UK city to have electric trams. And in all, there were 250 trams operating on 17 routes before it closed in 41. He was, by the way, the founder of the Bristol Aircraft Company and various other high things. He was a bit of a go-getter, really. And the other one I want to talk about is Brian Tucker. He was a Bristol architect who advocated an advanced transport for Avon scheme, which was based on the Tyneside Metro, namely with short tunnel in the city centre and running on the surface outside the city centre. But he didn't get anywhere. He was just before his time. 1992 he actually started in 1988. He was too advanced for his time. People were too keen on building motorways and more parking space. What gets drivers out of cars? Well, I've mentioned faster public transport, but not all faster public transport gets people out of cars. The Runcorn busway on the right there, and the Bristol busway underneath. I did a study of the Runcorn busway in 1982, when it had been open for over 10 years. And when it was designed and built, the anticipation was that half of all trips in Runcorn will be by bus. When I looked at it in 1982, 15% of trips in Runcorn were by bus. And the figure now is about 5%. And what's interesting about that was that the bus use was no higher than other towns of the same population size that didn't have busways. So the busway made absolutely no difference to the modal shift from cars. But we know that rail public transport does get people out of cars. And there are many studies right around the world which show that between 25 and 45% of rail passengers have left their car at home and have gone by rail. Well, ideally, a metro is the way to go, but it's very expensive, very slow and very disruptive. And one of the things about trams is that they give about 90% of the benefits of a metro, but at only 10% of the cost. It's a way to go. And Dave mentioned some old railway lines. Well, trams can run along old railway lines. All they need is electricity to do it. It's not very expensive. And Blackpool survived for a long time on old railway lines north of Bispham. I'm going to talk about Gothenburg. It also has a large tramway, but it has had a city centre with high levels of congestion, high levels of air pollution, and a lot of disruption to public transport from high levels of car usage. But it pioneered a new form of urban traffic management. What it did was divide the city centre into zones and use the zone boundaries as public transport routes and made it illegal to drive across the zone boundary in the city centre, but you could drive into a zone. And one of the advantages of that was that the priority public transport routes along the zone boundaries, public transport speeded up significantly. Cars were not allowed between zones, but they were allowed into zones, which meant that you didn't lose too much traffic. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So I thought, what if the Gothenburg principle was applied to Bristol city centre? And you can see the red lines are the ideal zone boundaries. The yellow lines are the main public transport routes. And the orange lines are the public transport routes along zone boundaries, which are exclusive. And that would make public transport circulation in Bristol city centre much faster. So what were the results in Gothenburg? Well, car trips into the city centre were slightly reduced. But city centre traffic was greatly reduced because there was less people hunting around looking for a parking space 100 metres nearer to their final destination. Because drivers drove into the zone nearest to their destination and parked in the first available space. So there was no searching for a nearer space. People actually walked a bit more. Public transport reliability improved dramatically. Speed increased as well. Public transport use went up. So the total number of trips into the city centre increased, which was great news for the businesses in the city centre because their footfall increased. Many years ago, I took a party of my students to Dortmund, and we were taken to a district centre. I'm trying to think of an example in Bristol. Someone will tell me no doubt. And it was lined with shops from both sides, and down the centre of the road were tram tracks, but not a sign of a tram in sight. So we asked the guy from the city council, what happened to the trams? Well, he said, the shopkeepers all campaigned for 20 years to get rid of the trams because it was stopping people driving to their shops and shopping. And what happened then? Well, we found a route, an alternative route for the trams, so they don't come down here anymore. And that was 2 years ago. So what's happened since? Well, for the last year, the shopkeepers have been campaigning to get the trams back because the footfall in their shops and their turnover has reduced. Because what they forgot was that people going to work in the morning would window shop and come home in the afternoon or in the evening and think, oh, I need some coffee or whatever, and get off the tram and go and buy some shopping. And many European cities have adopted this model. Bremen is probably a good example. Even Budapest, which was a communist city, has adopted this model. More radical still, I mentioned Strasbourg before. I'm going to talk about Strasbourg a bit. First tram line was opened in 1994 by Mayor Catherine Troutman. She was a bit of a pioneer, and she proposed as part of a policy to build trams. But her political colleagues said that was political suicide. No one would vote for that. It will make a big mess, and no one would vote for you again. So, in spite of that, she adopted a policy for a new tram network, and she won re-election several times. There's now 6 lines, 49-kilometre network. Patronage has grown from 25 million to 150 million. That was a 2019 one, which gives the average of 312 trips per head annually. It's a very impressive turnaround from a car-dominated city to a public transport-dominated city. And it's become the model for a lot of French cities. There are 30 cities have built tramways. Since 1984, we've built 6. And this is what it looks like. It's a big network. And the green line, which goes to the right, actually goes across the border between France and Germany. It's an international tramway. And you can see it serves both the city centre and the outlying districts reasonably well. But we know that we've only built 6 tramways in Britain, and there's been a lot of resistance to building more for all sorts of reasons, not least of which was the cost. So we need to reduce the cost, and the biggest cost is the infrastructure, of which the track is the most important. And over half the cost of building a tramway up to now has been the cost of the track. Because before you can put the track in, you've got to dig out all the utilities and move them somewhere else. Because once you put the track in on top of a half-metre thick concrete slab, 6 metres wide, you can't get to anything underneath it. And that means moving the utilities if you can find space. And that costs at least half of the cost of the tracks. And my little bit of contribution to lowering track costs has been my unique low height track system. I had a New Zealand visitor the other day, and we went over to Sheffield to look at it. It's been there for 29.5 years. I measured the wear on it. It's got at least another 20 years to go before the wheels touch the bottom of the groove. So 50 years life is not bad. It's not needed any maintenance. So it's a pretty robust system. And that's what it looks like, going from conventional girder track to my low height rail. The conventional girder track failed after 3 months operation, by the way, when it opened. And it was reducing the speed of trams to 5 miles an hour, which was not acceptable. And here's a Sheffield tram, in case you've not seen one, nice and bright in what was stagecoach colours, although it's now been taken back into control by Sheffield Public Transport Authority. There are no tram builders in Britain. There's only about 5 worldwide. And trams are a very small part of their business. Their business is usually building much bigger vehicles like trains, which is why many trams end up being cut-down trains, weighing with heavy weights, high costs, and very hungry power consumption. So this is my 22-ton baby. It carries 200 passengers. It was only after I took this picture I realised the significance. It was outside a shop in Blackpool, which was called Price Busters. Wasn't that a nice idea? This was it operating in Birkenhead, where there are very sharp curves and very steep hills, and it went round that without any difficulty at all. And that's what it looks like now, ready for action. And how do you get power to the trams? Low profile electrification system, which has been adopted in Manchester, which is the picture there, and in Nottingham. And by spreading the word, which is what I'm doing today, hopefully with some success. And if you haven't got it and you're feeling you can't sleep, buy my Light Rail Developer's Handbook, which will definitely put you to sleep if you're an insomniac. But it explains in quite a lot of detail how you build tramways and how you can operate them. By the way, that's a picture of the big tram stop in Strasbourg. Homme de Fer, it's called. People of Steel. And this is a book which I've written. It's coming out next month, all about tram tracks. So on your Christmas list, Light Rail Developer's Handbook or Embedded Tracks, keep you out of mischief. And a little thank you for all my efforts. I was granted the Lifetime Achievement Award in Railway Engineering Research in 2023. So what about road capacity? Well, we know that a tram line increases a road lane capacity 8-fold, which means that you can reduce carriageway width by still carrying the same number of people, leaving space for active travel. Now, wouldn't it be good if you could cycle somewhere in your city without fear of being run down by a car or bumping into a car that's parked in a bike lane, etc., etc. But how? Well, we've got several European models, continental models to work on, which I think the Barcelona one is probably the best one. And there, the mayor of Barcelona decided that over 10 years, virtually all the streets in the city centre would be resurfaced. So while they were resurfacing, they would reduce the carriageway width and reallocate the space released for either more civic space or more pavement space for people to walk, or for bike lanes, and in some cases for bus lanes. And we have the Strasbourg model, building one tram line at a time. Until now you've got 6. And as Mayor Troutman says, people love trams. If you look at all the surveys that have been done, if you ask people what they would prefer, if they would prefer trams, 80% vote for trams. It's a very high proportion. Unfortunately, many councillors are behind the curve. And because trams give lots of other benefits, not just better public transport, but cleaner air, quieter streets, trams are very quiet. And those delivering trams get re-elected. Getting Bristol on the right track, who knows? No doubt someone will tell me the busway is an outstanding success and it's going to be extended everywhere. Right, another book for your Christmas shopping list, Strong Towns. And Charles Mahone showed quite instinctively that much public expenditure on infrastructure projects was wasted, primarily because money was allocated for infrastructure building, but not for maintenance, which is why we've ended up with so many potholes in Britain, because we can build roads but not maintain them. And then we have the money tree. I don't know if anyone's got one in their back garden. I certainly don't. But trams, public transport improvements, needs money. Someone's got to find it from somewhere. So how about getting new tramways built? Well, the biggest stumbling block, as far as I can see, is the National Audit Report on tramways, which said that trams cost too much, they're very difficult to get approval for, that they don't deliver the objectives that were claimed, and they generally lose money, so they need to be subsidised. Now, some of you will no doubt say, what's wrong with the subsidy? Well, nothing's wrong with the subsidy if someone's willing to pay for it. And when we have a situation where the National Health Service, schools, housing are all needing more money, I don't think anybody's going to be jumping up and down to promote a tramway, which not only would require public money, but also public money to support its operation. And we know there's little government funding. It's a big dilemma that not just Britain has, but other countries as well. And in spite of all of that, we still have resistance from the car lobbies, as signified by the low traffic zones, which have been campaigned against by many groups, which essentially are car lobby groups. Ironically, the first low traffic zone was introduced in London in the 1960s in Pimlico. In the after study, what was discovered was that the number of car trips within the Pimlico zone dramatically reduced, but the amount of traffic on roads around the zone didn't increase, it just disappeared. And as Professor Sir Colin Buchanan wrote in his 1963 seminal work, Traffic in Towns, building a road in a city is like building a ditch in a waterlogged field. It always fills with water. So the thing to do is not to build roads, but to improve public transport, which is what he advocated. Difficulty of public finance, because there's always an opportunity cost. £300 million for tramway, that's a new hospital at least, or 2 hospitals sometimes, 4 or 5 schools, so there's alternative uses for that kind of money. So maybe we need another way of doing this with organisations which are dedicated. And that's why I mentioned George White, Sir George White, as it turns out, because he set up an organisation, Imperial Tramways, which built tramways all around the country, not just in Bristol. And he used private funding, which meant he didn't have to go cap in hand to the Department for Treasury and fit in with the Green Book of the Treasury's requirements. If it was going to cover its costs, then it could be funded privately. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen.